The Mahābhārata or Mahābhārata is one of the two major Sanskrit epics of ancient India, the other being the Ramayana. The Mahābhārata is an epic narrative of the Kurukshetra War and the fates of the Kaurava and the Pandava princes. It also contains philosophical and devotional material, such as a discussion of the four goals of life, or Purusharthas. Among the principal works and stories in the Mahābhārata are the Bhagavad Gita, the story of Damayanti, an abbreviated version of the Ramayana, and the Rishyasringa, often considered as works in their own right. Traditionally, the authorship of the Mahābhārata is attributed to Vyasa. There have been many attempts to unravel its historical growth and compositional layers. The oldest preserved parts of the text are thought to be not much older than around 400 BCE, though the origins of the epic probably fall between the 8th and 9th centuries BCE. The text probably reached its final form by the early Gupta period. The title may be translated as The Great Tale of the Bharata Dynasty. According to the Mahābhārata itself, the tale is extended from a shorter version of 24,000 verses called simply Bharata. The Mahābhārata is the longest known epic poem and has been described as the longest poem ever written. Its longest version consists of over 100,000 shloka or over 200,000 individual verse lines, and long prose passages. About 1.8 million words in total, the Mahābhārata is roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, or about 4 times the length of the Ramayana. W.J. Johnson has compared the importance of the Mahābhārata in the context of world civilization to that of the Bible, the works of Shakespeare, the works of Homer, Greek drama, or the Quran. Textual history and structure. The epic is traditionally ascribed to the sage Vyasa, who is also a major character in the epic. Vyasa described it as being itihasa. He also describes the Guru-Shishya Parampara, which traces all great teachers and their students of the Vedic times. The first section of the Mahābhārata states that it was Ganesha who wrote down the text to Vyasa's dictation. Ganesha is said to have agreed to write it only if Vyasa never paused in his recitation. Vyasa agrees on condition that Ganesha takes the time to understand what was said before writing it down. The epic employs the story within a story structure, otherwise known as frame tales, popular in many Indian religious and non-religious works. It is recited by the sage Vaisampayana, a disciple of Vyasa, to the king Janamejaya, who is the great-grandson of the Pandava prince Arjuna. The story is then recited again by a professional storyteller named Ugrasravasauta, many years later, to an assemblage of sages performing the 12-year sacrifice for the king Saunika Kulapati in the Naimisha forest. The text has been described by some early 20th century Western Indologists as unstructured and chaotic. Hermann Oldenburg supposed that the original poem must once have carried an immense, tragic force, but dismissed the full text as a horrible chaos. Moritz Winternitz considered that only unpoetical theologists and clumsy scribes could have lumped the parts of disparate origin into an unordered whole. Accretion and redaction research on the Mahābhārata has put an enormous effort into recognizing and dating layers within the text. Some elements of the present Mahābhārata can be traced back to Vedic times. The background to the Mahābhārata suggests the origin of the epic occurs after the very early Vedic period, and before the First Indian Empire was to rise in the 3rd century BC, that this is a date not too far removed from the 8th or 9th century BC, is likely. It is generally agreed that, unlike the Vedas, which have to be preserved letter perfect, the epic was a popular work whose reciters would inevitably conform to changes in language and style, so the earliest, surviving, components of this dynamic text are believed to be no older than the earliest, external, references we have to the epic, which may include an allusion in Panini's 4th century BC grammar Ashtadhyayi 4, 2, 5, 6. It is estimated that the Sanskrit texts probably reached something of a final form by the early Gupta period. Vishnu Sukthankar, editor of the first great critical edition of the Mahābhārata, commented, "It is useless to think of reconstructing a fluid text in a literally original shape, on the basis of an archetype and a stemma codicum. What then is possible? Our objective can only be to reconstruct the oldest form of the text which it is possible to reach on the basis of the manuscript material available. That manuscript evidence is somewhat late, given its material composition and the climate of India, but it is very extensive. The Mahābhārata itself distinguishes a core portion of 24,000 verses, the Bharata proper, as opposed to additional secondary material, while the Ashvalayanagraya Sutra makes a similar distinction. At least 3 redactions of the text are commonly recognized. Jaya with 8,800 verses attributed to Vyasa, Bharata with 24,000 verses as recited by Vaisampayana, and finally the Mahābhārata as recited by Ugrasravasauta with over 100,000 verses. However, some scholars, such as John Brockington, argue that Jaya and Bharata refer to the same text, and ascribe the theory of Jaya with 8,800 verses to a misreading of a verse in Adiparvan. The redaction of this large body of text was carried out after formal principles, emphasizing the numbers chapter 18 and 12. The addition of the latest parts may be dated by the absence of the Anushasana Parva and the Virata Parva from the Spitzer manuscript. The oldest surviving Sanskrit text dates to the Kushan period. According to what one character says at MBH 1.1.50, there were 3 versions of the epic, beginning with Manu, Astika or Vasu, respectively. These versions would correspond to the addition of one and then another frame settings of dialogues. The Vasu version would omit the frame settings and begin with the account of the birth of Vyasa. The Astika version would add the Sarpasatra and Ashvamedha material from Brahmanical literature, introduce the name Mahābhārata, and identify Vyasa as the work's author. The redactors of these editions were probably Pankaratrine scholars who, according to Oberle's, likely retained control over the text until its final redaction. Mention of the Huna in the Bhishma Parva, however, appears to imply that this Parva may have been edited around the 4th century. The Adi Parva includes the snake sacrifice of Janamejaya, explaining its motivation, detailing why all snakes in existence were intended to be destroyed, and why in spite of this, there are still snakes in existence. This Sarpasatra material was often considered an independent tale added to a version of the Mahābhārata by thematic attraction, and considered to have a particularly close connection to Vedic literature. The Panchavimsha Brahmana enumerates the officiant priests of a Sarpasatra, among whom the names Dhritarashtra and Janamejaya, 2 main characters of the Mahābhārata's Sarpasatra, as well as Takshaka, the name of a snake in the Mahābhārata, occur. Historical references: the earliest known references to the Mahābhārata and its core Bharata date to the Ashtadhyayi of Panini and in the Ashvalayanagraya Sutra. This may mean the core 24,000 verses, known as the Bharata, as well as an early version of the extended Mahābhārata, were composed by the 4th century BCE. A report by the Greek writer Dio Chrysostom about Homer's poetry being sung even in India seems to imply that the Iliad had been translated into Sanskrit. However, scholars have, in general, taken this as evidence for the existence of a Mahābhārata at this date, whose episodes Dio or his sources identify with the story of the Iliad. Several stories within the Mahābhārata took on separate identities of their own in classical Sanskrit literature. For instance, Abhijnana Shakuntala by the renowned Sanskrit poet Kalidasa, believed to have lived in the era of the Gupta dynasty, is based on a story that is the precursor to the Mahābhārata. Urabhanga, a Sanskrit play written by Bhasa who is believed to have lived before Kalidasa, is based on the slaying of Duryodhana by the splitting of his thighs by Bhima. The copperplate inscription of the Mahāraja Sharvanatha from Kaur describes the Mahābhārata as a collection of 100,000 verses. The 18 parvas or books. The division into 18 parvas is as follows. Historical context. The historicity of the Kurukshetra War is unclear. Many historians estimate the date of the Kurukshetra War to Iron Age India of the 10th century BCE. The setting of the epic has a historical precedent in Iron Age India, where the Kuru kingdom was the center of political power during roughly 1200 to 800 BCE. A dynastic conflict of the period could have been the inspiration for the Jaya, the foundation on which the Mahābhārata corpus was built, with a climactic battle eventually coming to be viewed as an epochal event. Puranic literature presents genealogical lists associated with the Mahābhārata narrative. The evidence of the Puranas is of two kinds. Of the first kind, there is the direct statement that there were 10-15 years between the birth of Parikshit and the accession of Mahāpadmananda, which would yield an estimate of about 1400 BCE for the Bharata battle. However, this would imply improbably long reigns on average for the kings listed in the genealogies. Of the second kind are analyses of parallel genealogies in the Puranas between the times of Adi-Sima-Krishna and Mahāpadmananda. Pargata accordingly estimated 26 generations by averaging 10 different dynastic lists and, assuming 18 years for the average duration of a reign, arrived at an estimate of 850 BCE for Adi-Sima-Krishna, and thus approximately 950 BCE for the Bharata battle. B.B. Lal used the same approach with the more conservative assumption of the average reign to estimate a date of 836 BCE, and correlated this with archaeological evidence from painted greyware sites, the association being strong between PGW artifacts and places mentioned in the epic. Attempts to date the events using methods of archaeoastronomy have produced, depending on which passages are chosen and how they are interpreted, estimates ranging from the late 4th to the mid-2nd millennium BCE. The late 4th millennium date has a precedent in the calculation of the Kali Yuga epoch, based on planetary conjunctions by Aryabhata. Aryabhata's date of February 18, 3102 BCE for Mahābhārata war has become widespread in Indian tradition. Coincidentally, this marks the disappearance of Krishna from earth from many sources. The eye-hole inscription of Pulakeshi II, dated to circa 556 = 634 CE, claims that 3,735 years have elapsed since the Bharata battle, putting the date of Mahābhārata war at 3137 BCE. Another traditional school of astronomers and historians, represented by Vriddhagārga, Varahamihira and Kalhana, placed the Bharata War 653 years after the Kali Yuga epoch, corresponding to 2449 BCE.